A 72-year-old woman returns home to find her life packed into suitcases on the sidewalk. Taped to the front is a terrifying note in her own son's handwriting. If you want to stay here, you must become her. This isn't just a threat to kick her out. It's a key to a 50-year-old secret, a buried body, and a web of lies that protected a monster. What happens when a grandmother has to destroy her own family to finally find justice? This is a story you have to see to believe. Make sure you subscribe and press that notification bell, because the truth that's about to be unearthed will shock you to your core. The taxi pulled away from the curb, its engine a low hum that quickly faded, leaving behind a profound and unsettling quiet. I stood on the sidewalk, my hand still half raised in a wave I hadn't truly meant. Before me stood the house. Not just a house, the house. 2 stories of proud brick and ivy, with a slate roof that shimmered like a fish's scales in the late afternoon sun of Willow Creek. For 50 years, this structure had been my world, my sanctuary, my prison, my stage. The lawn was a perfect manicured green. The rose bushes my late husband Richard had been so proud of were bursting with blood-red blooms. It was a picture of suburban perfection, a carefully curated lie I had helped maintain my entire adult life. My trip had only been a week, a small respite to visit my sister in Oregon's wine country, but in that short time, a subtle wrongness had taken root. I felt it before I saw it. It was in the air, in the way the oak tree's shadow fell just a little too long across the porch. And then I saw them. My suitcases. Not one, but all 3. My antique leather-bound luggage, a wedding gift from Richard half a century ago. They weren't tucked discreetly by the door. They were on the public sidewalk, a declaration for the whole neighborhood to see. Discarded. For a moment, all I felt was a hot flush of annoyance. David. It had to be David and his wife, Sarah. This was their style. Passive-aggressive, needlessly cruel. Another move in their slow, grinding campaign to convince me this house was too much for me, that I was too much for it. They probably thought this was a clever, symbolic gesture. Look, Mother, you're already halfway out the door. I walked closer, my sensible shoes making a soft, crunching sound on the pavement. My hand wrinkled and spotted with age, reached out to touch the worn leather of the largest case. That's when I saw the note. It was a single piece of white paper torn from a legal pad, held down by a strip of clear packing tape. The writing was instantly painfully familiar. It was David's looping, slightly impatient script, the same script from years of birthday cards and reluctant thank you notes. But the words were not his. They couldn't be. I leaned in my breath, catching in my throat. If you want to stay here, you must become her. Confusion was the first wave. It was a bizarre, nonsensical phrase. A poorly worded ultimatum, become who Sarah. The thought was so absurd it was almost laughable. Me become that grasping, brittle woman with her cold eyes and her talk of property values. But the flicker of dark humor died instantly, because the phrase snagged on something deep inside me, something rusted and heavy that had been chained to the bottom of my soul for 50 years. Become her. The world tilted. The cheerful red of the roses seemed to mock me. The perfect brick house loomed like a mausoleum. That phrase wasn't a clumsy threat from my son. It was a ghost. It was the echo of a whisper from a lifetime ago, a command I had once obeyed to save my own skin. A cold dread so ancient and familiar, it felt like a part of my own blood began to seep into my bones. It was a terror I hadn't allowed myself to feel since I was a young woman of 22. The terror of Richard. But Richard was dead. He'd been in the ground for 3 months. So how could his voice be here on a note written in our son's hand? My own hand began to tremble, not with the gentle tremor of age, but with a violent, deep-seated fear. I ripped the note from the suitcase. The tape pulled with a sharp, ugly sound. I crumpled the paper in my fist, the sharp edges digging into my palm. I had to get inside. The weight of the suitcases was immense, far heavier than when I had packed them. Each one felt filled with stones with the dead weight of the past. I grunted, dragging the largest one up the single step of the walkway, its wheels rattling against the concrete. It felt like I was dragging a coffin. My keys were in my purse. I fumbled for them, my fingers suddenly clumsy and useless. The brass key, worn smooth from a million turns, scraped against the lock. For a horrifying second, I thought they had changed the locks. The thought was so vile, so absolute in its cruelty, that it almost brought me to my knees. But then the tumblers turned with a familiar, heavy clunk, and the door swung inward. I stepped inside and was met with a wall of silence. But it wasn't the peaceful silence of an empty home. It was a curated, sterile silence. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and something else. Sarah's perfume. Her presence was an occupation. A new, artfully distressed throw blanket was draped over my favorite armchair. The collection of porcelain birds on the mantel had been rearranged. Small changes, territorial markings. She was slowly erasing me piece by piece. "David," I called out. My voice was thin, a stranger's voice in my own hall. "Sarah." Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner answered me. The sound, usually a comfort, was now a countdown. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the dim light of the foyer, I uncrumpled the note. The words seemed to writhe on the page. "You must become her." I sank into the armchair, armchair, it felt like now, and stared at the photograph on the mantelpiece. It was Richard accepting some community award a few years back. The silver frame gleamed. He was smiling, his teeth a perfect predatory white. The beloved philanthropist, the titan of local business, the grieving widower who had found love again with me. The man the entire town of Willow Creek had admired. The man who had meticulously, patiently, and sadistically destroyed my life in the privacy of these four walls. And as I stared at his smiling face, the silence in the house dissolved, replaced by the memory of a different kind of quiet. The suffocating, performative quiet of his funeral. The organ music was a thick, syrupy dirge that coated everything in the church, with a veneer of respectable grief. I sat in the front pew, a black veil partially obscuring my face. My back was straight, my hands folded demurely in my lap. I was playing the part I had perfected over a lifetime, the devoted, heartbroken widow. From the corner of my eye, I could see my son David, his shoulders slumped. He was genuinely grieving the larger-than-life father he had worshipped. Beside him, Sarah dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue, her expression a careful mask of sorrow. I knew she was calculating the cost of the floral arrangements. I didn't cry for Richard. My tears had run dry decades ago. No, the hollowness I felt was for someone else. It was for the girl I used to be, the one who walked into this life full of hope. It was for the woman I might have become if I hadn't met him. I was mourning a life I had never been allowed to live, and the performance of grieving the man who stole it from me was the most exquisite torture. Later, back at the house, the performance continued. The rooms were filled with people I'd known for years, their faces etched with practiced sympathy. They squeezed my hand, murmured platitudes. He was such a pillar of the community. Willow Creek won't be the same without him. You were so lucky to have him for so long, Elizabeth. Each word was a small, sharp stone pelting the armor I had built around myself. I would nod, offer a weak, watery smile, and thank them for their kindness, all the while feeling like a ghost in my own home. I needed a moment. A single, solitary moment away from the prying eyes and empty words. I slipped away from a conversation about Richard's golf handicap and headed toward the kitchen, ostensibly to check on the catering. The swinging door to the large walk-in pantry was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped into the cool, dark space, leaning my head back against a sack of flour. The scent of spices and dry goods was grounding. For a blessed second, there was only silence, and then I heard their voices from the kitchen, low and urgent, shielded from the polite chatter of the reception. David and Sarah. The real estate agent I spoke to was very clear. Sarah was saying, her voice a sharp, clinical whisper that cut through the air. With the current market, especially in this part of Willow Creek, we are looking at 7 figures, easily. The land value alone is astronomical. There was a pause. I heard the clink of a glass being set down on the granite countertop. Sarah, for God's sake, not now. David's voice was strained, exhausted. My father was just buried. There are people in the next room. Those people are eating your father's ridiculously expensive catering and talking about how much they'll miss playing bridge with him. She shot back, her voice laced with contempt. This is exactly the time to talk about it, David. While things are in flux, it's just impractical. Let's be realistic. A woman her age in a house this size all alone. The upkeep, the property taxes, the maintenance. It's not a home anymore, it's a burden. She can't manage it. It's her home, David said, but his words lacked conviction. They were the flimsy defense of a man who had already surrendered. It's an asset. Sarah corrected him, her tone final. A major asset that is currently being underutilized. Think of the kids' college funds. Think of our future. Moving her somewhere, more appropriate, would be doing her a favor. It's the responsible thing to do. I held my breath, pressing my ear closer to the door. I pushed it open just a fraction of an inch, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness of the pantry. I could see them standing by the island. David was staring down into his drink, swirling the amber liquid. He looked lost, a boy playing dress-up in his father's world. But Sarah was alive. Her eyes were bright, energized. Her gaze wasn't on her husband. It was sweeping across the room, cataloguing, appraising. I watched as she ran a perfectly manicured finger along the edge of the sterling silver tea service that had been my grandmother's. It wasn't a touch of admiration. It was a touch of ownership, a predatory caress. In her eyes, I saw the reflection of every valuable thing in that house converted into a dollar amount. There was no grief in her, not a shred, only avarice. A cold, glittering greed that was more chilling than any of the fake sympathy in the living room. That was the moment the ground shifted beneath me. The vague unease I'd felt about them for years crystallized into a sharp, painful certainty. They weren't just thinking about the future. They were plotting. They saw me not as a grieving widow, not as David's mother, but as an obstacle, an inconvenient, aging variable in their financial equation, a cold fire. Something I hadn't felt in a long, long time began to smolder in my chest. This house, this gilded cage Richard had built to keep me, was the last thing on this earth that was mine. He had taken my youth, my spirit, my name. I would be damned if I let his weak-willed son and his rapacious wife take the cage too. I straightened up, pushing myself away from the wall. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed the front of my black dress, and composed my face back into the mask of gentle sorrow. When I pushed the pantry door open and walked back into the kitchen, they both started guilt flashing briefly across David's face before it was replaced by his usual hangdog expression. Sarah, however, just smiled. "Oh, Mother," she said, her voice dripping with counterfeit concern. "There you are. Are you holding up okay?" I looked at her at the lie of her smile and gave her a small, sad nod. "I'm just a little tired," I said, my voice perfectly pitched to sound fragile. It's been a long day, but as I walked past them back into the crowd of mourners, I knew the day was far from over. A new battle was just beginning. And looking at them then, I knew that they had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw a frail old woman. They didn't see the survivor. The memory evaporated as quickly as it had come, leaving me back in the silent, imposing living room. The headlights of a car swept across the wall, momentarily illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A car door slammed shut, then another. They were home. The low murmur of their voices grew louder as they approached the front door. I braced myself, my hand tightening on the crumpled note in my lap. The confrontation was no longer a future possibility. It was here. The key turned in the lock, and the door swung open. David and Sarah stepped into the foyer, stopping short when they saw me sitting there, flanked by my luggage like a deposed queen. Sarah recovered first, of course. Her face broke into a wide, brilliant smile that didn't touch her cold, assessing eyes. "Mother, you're back." She chirped, her voice a pitch too high. "We were getting so worried. We didn't know exactly when you were arriving. We thought we'd just get your things out from underfoot for you." She gestured vaguely at the suitcases on the porch. "Make it easier to bring them in." The lie was so bald, so insulting, that I almost gasped. David shuffled behind her, his gaze fixed firmly on the parquet floor. He looked like a schoolboy caught cheating on an exam. He couldn't meet my eyes. I didn't smile back at Sarah. I slowly, deliberately held up the crumpled piece of paper. "And this?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "What is this supposed to be, some kind of welcome home joke?" Sarah actually laughed, a short, sharp, unconvincing sound. "Oh, that honestly, Elizabeth, you can't take anything David does seriously. He was just being silly, grabbing a piece of paper. A weird turn of phrase, that's all. You know how he gets when he's trying to be funny." She nudged him with her elbow. "Tell her, David." David flinched. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine for a fleeting, miserable second before skittering away again. "It was nothing, Mom. Just a stupid joke. I'm sorry." His voice was a mumble, thick with shame. He was a terrible liar. He always had been. But Sarah was a professional. She swept into the room, all bustling efficiency, already taking charge. "Never mind that," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "We need to talk. Seriously? David and I have been doing a lot of thinking while you were away. A lot of worrying, actually." She perched on the edge of the stiff, formal sofa opposite me, crossing her legs. She looked like a CEO about to deliver a hostile takeover bid. "This house." She began, her tone softening into one of deep, feigned concern. "It's just too much for you, Elizabeth. We see how you struggle sometimes. The stairs, the garden, all the cleaning. And it's so isolated. We found the most wonderful place. It's called the Golden Meadow." She said the name as if it were a paradise on earth. "It's a high-end assisted living community. It's more like a 5-star resort, really. They have a pool, art classes, gourmet meals, and top-notch round-the-clock medical staff. You would be safe. You'd have friends your own age. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." I just stared at her, my face a blank mask. I let the silence stretch, watching her. And the best part, she continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, is that we could take over this house. We'd move in, manage the property, handle all the finances and the upkeep. It would stay in the family. You wouldn't have to worry about selling it or anything. We would just manage it for you. All you'd have to do is sign a few papers. It just makes sense." She finished her speech and sat back, her smile expectant, as if she'd just offered me the keys to the kingdom instead of a death sentence. I took a slow breath. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, the kind of calm that comes when the worst thing you can imagine is finally happening. "No," I said. The word was small, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a gavel. Sarah's smile twitched. "No, What do you mean, no? I mean, no. I repeated, my voice stronger now. I rose slowly from the armchair, feeling the strength in my legs, in my spine. I will not be moving to the Golden Meadow. I will not be signing my house over to you. This is my home. I am not leaving. The change in Sarah was instantaneous. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The mask of sweet concern dissolved, and the face beneath it was hard, cold, and contemptuous. I see, she said, her voice dropping to an icy monotone. We were afraid you'd be difficult. Stubbornness can be a symptom, you know. My blood ran cold. A symptom of what? Of cognitive decline. She said the words sharp and precise, like a surgeon's scalpel. When an elderly person starts making irrational choices, when they can't see what's best for them, when they put themselves and their family's financial security at risk out of simple pride. I turned my gaze to my son. He stood frozen by the doorway, his face ashen. David, I said, my voice pleading now. Listen to what she's saying. Do you hear this? He just stared at the floor, his jaw working silently. Sarah stood up, a predator sensing weakness. There are legal avenues, Elizabeth, she said, taking a step toward me. We've already consulted a lawyer just to understand our options. It's called a conservatorship. When a judge determines that a person is no longer capable of making sensible decisions for their own welfare or of managing their own financial affairs, the court can appoint someone to do it for them. A conservator. She let the word hang in the air. And I wonder what a judge would think. She continued, her voice a low, threatening purr. An elderly widow all alone. Her loving son and daughter-in-law present her with a safe, secure, financially sound option for her care. And she refuses. She chooses to stay in a huge, decaying house she can't possibly maintain. She makes strange, paranoid accusations. A judge would see that we are just trying to protect you, to protect the family's assets. They would understand. It wasn't a proposal. It was a threat, a declaration of war. They would paint me as senile, crazy, incompetent. They would strip me of my home, my money, and my autonomy. They would have me locked away in some beige room while they lived in my house, sleeping in my bed, spending my money. I looked at David, my son, the baby I had held in my arms, the boy whose tears I had wiped away. I looked at him, searching for a spark of love, of loyalty, of simple human decency. David, I whispered the name, a shard of glass in my throat. Is this what you want? To stand in a courtroom and tell a judge that your own mother has lost her mind so you can take her house? He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, agonizing mix of shame and resentment. It's for the best, Mum. He mumbled the words, sounding rehearsed. It's what Dad would have wanted. For you to be taken care of. And that was it. The final killing blow. Invoking Richard. Using the memory of my tormentor to justify my destruction. In that moment, looking from my son's weak, defeated face to my daughter-in-law's triumphant, cruel smirk, I realized the truth. The fight was not about the house. It was never just about the house. They didn't just want my property. They wanted to erase me, to declare me null and void, to finish the job that Richard had started 50 years ago. The crumpled note in my hand suddenly felt searing hot. You must become her. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a random phrase. It was a prophecy. Richard had tried to make me into a ghost, a replacement for the woman he'd murdered. And now, his legacy living on in the greed and weakness of his son, was trying to do it all over again. But something inside me, something that had been dormant for half a century, roared to life. It was the ghost of that 22-year-old girl, the one who had survived. The terror I had felt earlier was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But now it was mixed with something else, something hot and clean and sharp. Rage, a righteous, liberating rage, They thought I was a frail, confused old woman. They had no idea. They had just awakened a sleeping dragon. I stood up straighter, my gaze unflinching. I looked at Sarah's smug face and David's averted eyes. The battle lines were drawn. The fight for my house, for my sanity, for my very name had just begun, and I would not lose. Not again. The words on the paper were a ghost, a 50-year-old phantom that had followed her home. If you want to stay here, you must become her. It wasn't David's handwriting. She knew that now. The looping, arrogant script was a perfect imitation, a cruel echo of the original. But the message was a key, turning in a lock deep inside her, opening a room she had bricked over decades ago. Sleep offered no escape. It only pulled her back into the suffocating velvet of the past. The first year of her marriage, 1974. The house was the same, yet different. It was Richard's house. Everything in it was his, or more accurately, theirs. His and Amelia's. The ghost was everywhere. Elizabeth was the intruder. She's 22 again, standing in the master bedroom, the afternoon sun slanting through the bay window. Richard is holding up a dress. It's made of pale yellow silk, with delicate lace at the collar. It's beautiful, but it feels like a costume. "Try this on," he says. His voice is not a request. It is a command, wrapped in the soft paper of courtesy. "Richard, it's lovely, but it's not really my style." He doesn't look at her. He's looking at the dress, his eyes distant, seeing someone else. It was Amelia's. It was her favorite. She looked ethereal in it, like sunlight. He finally turns his gaze on Elizabeth. "It's cool appraising. I want to see it on you." She takes the dress. The silk feels cold against her skin. She slips it on in the walk-in closet, the scent of old perfume, a faint floral ghost clinging to the fabric. It's a little too tight in the shoulders, a little too short in the waist. Amelia must have been more petite, more delicate. When she steps out, Richard's face tightens. A flicker of disappointment quickly masked. "It'll do," he says, turning away. "Wear it for dinner tonight. We're having the Carsons over." She spends the rest of the afternoon feeling like a fraud, the borrowed silk, a constant itching reminder that she is a replacement part. A placeholder. The memory dissolves, replaced by the clatter of silverware. A few weeks later. The dining room lit by the heavy crystal chandelier. She has spent all day on the meal. A perfect beef Wellington, her mother's recipe. A dish she is proud of. Richard takes a bite. He chews slowly, deliberately, his eyes closed, as if in deep contemplation. He swallows, takes a sip of his wine, and sets the glass down with a precise click. "The pastry is adequate," he says, his voice dangerously soft. "But the duxelles, it's missing something." Amelia used a touch of brandy in hers. It elevated the entire dish, made it sing. He looks at her, a thin, unsmiling line on his lips. "Yours is just competent." Shame, hot and sharp, prickles her cheeks. I can try that next time." "No," he says, pushing his plate away slightly. "You will try it again tomorrow. We will have this again tomorrow night, and the night after, until you get it right." He picks up his wineglass. "I will not have mediocrity at my table." She feels herself shrinking in her chair, the vast, polished mahogany table stretching between them like a chasm. The house is so quiet, so silent. It absorbs her fear, her humiliation, and gives nothing back. Another memory surfaces jagged and sharp. A Saturday afternoon. She'd bought a record. A folk singer, she loved, a woman with a voice like honey and smoke. She'd put it on the turntable in the living room, the gentle guitar filling the oppressive silence of the house. For a few minutes, she felt like herself. Richard came home early. He strode into the room, his briefcase in hand, his face a thundercloud. He walked straight to the record player and lifted the needle with a violent scratch. The silence that rushed back in was worse than his shouting. "What is this?" Whining, he demanded. "It's Joan Baez. I like her." "Amelia?" He said, his voice low and guttural, hated this kind of sentimental nonsense. She had taste. She listened to classical. Bach, Vivaldi, music with structure, with intelligence. He picked up the album cover, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "This is noise for children and hippies. It has no place in this house." He walked over to the fireplace where a low fire was burning and tossed the record and its sleeve into the flames. The vinyl curled, blackened, and melted. It made a sickening hissing sound. Elizabeth just stood there, frozen. A part of her was melting with it. "You are my wife now, Elizabeth," he said, turning back to her, his eyes like chips of ice. "You are Mrs. Richard Vance. You are filling a space that a remarkable woman left vacant. The least you can do is try to honor her memory. You will not bring your common tastes into her home. You will learn what she liked. You will adopt her preferences. You will become the woman this house deserves." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy as stones. "Do you understand me?" She nodded, unable to speak past the lump of terror in her throat. "Good," he said, his tone shifting back to one of casual authority. "Now what's for dinner? I'm in the mood for Amelia's coq au vin." The door to that bricked-up room in her mind was now wide open. The ghosts were out, and they were screaming. She sat in the heavy silence of her living room, clutching the note, the words blurring through a film of tears that would not fall. The house held its breath, waiting. Then the doorbell chimed. For a moment, she was paralyzed. Was it them back already? Had they called the lawyer, the men in white coats? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She forced herself to stand her legs unsteady. She smoothed her cardigan, wiped her clammy hands on her slacks, and walked to the door. When she opened it, she wasn't prepared for the face she saw. It was a face from a better, brighter world. Chloe, her granddaughter, stood on the porch, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a laptop bag over the other. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her sharp, intelligent eyes, so unlike David's, so much more like her own once upon a time, were filled with warmth. Grandma Surprise Chloe beamed, stepping forward and wrapping her in a hug. The embrace was firm, real. It grounded Elizabeth in the present. "My con law professor cancelled our seminar for a week, so I thought I'd hop on a train and come see my favorite person." A genuine smile touched Elizabeth's lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "Oh, my dear girl, it's so good to see you." She ushered her inside. "But why didn't you call?" Chloe's smile faltered as she stepped into the foyer. Her eyes, quick and perceptive, took in everything at once. The oppressive stillness of the house. The single suitcase standing like a silent accusation by the staircase. And the deep, etched fear in her grandmother's eyes. "I wanted it to be a surprise," Chloe said, her voice softer now, her gaze moving from the suitcase back to Elizabeth's face. "Is everything okay?" Before Elizabeth could answer, the swinging door from the dining room pushed open, and Sarah emerged, a calculating smile plastered on her face. "Chloe, what a surprise." "We weren't expecting you." David followed her out, looking flustered. "Chloe, honey, you should have told us you were coming." The atmosphere in the foyer instantly became thick and toxic. Chloe's posture shifted. The easygoing student was gone, replaced by something sharper, more guarded. "Well, I'm here now," Chloe said, her tone light, but with an edge of steel. "I was just asking Grandma what's up with the luggage. Is someone going on a trip?" Sarah laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound. "Oh, that. Your grandmother and I were just doing a bit of Spring cleaning. You know how it is. Sometimes you have to clear out the old to make way for the new. Right, Chloe said slowly, her eyes locked on Sarah. Spring cleaning. In October. And it starts with Grandma's personal suitcase. She looked at her father. Dad. David wouldn't meet her gaze. He just shuffled his feet, looking at the ornate patterns on the Persian rug. Your grandmother and we've been having some disagreements, honey, about what's best for her. And you decided what's best for her is to pack her bag and leave it by the door. Chloe's voice was dangerously quiet. It's complicated, David mumbled. It doesn't seem that complicated, Chloe shot back. It seems pretty straightforward, actually. Elizabeth watched the exchange, a flicker of something long dormant stirring within her. It was courage. Seeing Chloe stand up to them so fearlessly was like being handed a shield. David. Sarah Elizabeth said, her voice steadier than she expected. Chloe and I would like to catch up, alone. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but one look at the set of Chloe's jaw seemed to change her mind. She gave a tight nod. Of course. We'll be in the kitchen, making plans. The last word was a threat. She and David retreated, leaving a cold silence in their wake. Chloe waited until the dining room door swung shut. Then she turned to Elizabeth, her expression a mixture of fury and deep concern. Grandma, talk to me. What in the hell is going on? And don't you dare tell me it's nothing. Elizabeth's resolve crumbled. The fear, the humiliation, the decades of silence all came pouring out. She led Chloe into the living room, the one place that felt more hers than Richard's, and sank into her armchair. They want the house, Chloe. She began, her voice a ragged whisper. Your grandfather left it to me free and clear, but they see it as their inheritance. They see me as an inconvenience. She recounted the conversation from the day before. The offer of the luxury nursing home, the management of her assets, Sarah's cruel threat about having her declared incompetent. Chloe listened, her anger growing with every word. She knelt by Elizabeth's chair, taking her grandmother's trembling hands in her own. Incompetent. On what grounds? Because you don't want to be kicked out of your own home? That's not how conservatorship works. They can't just do that. They think I'm old, Elizabeth said. They think I'm weak. They think I'll just roll over and let them do it. She paused, took a deep, shuddering breath, and made a decision. For 50 years, she had carried her secrets alone. The burden was too heavy. But it's more than that. There's something else. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out the folded piece of paper. The ghost. She handed it to Chloe. Chloe unfolded it carefully. She read the words, her brow furrowed in confusion. If you want to stay here, you must become her. She looked up at Elizabeth. What does this mean? I recognize the handwriting. It's Dad's. Elizabeth shook her head slowly. No, it's not. It's a copy. But that's not what's important right now. They found it. I think David found it, and he's using it. Using something he doesn't understand to scare me. Scare you who is her? Chloe pressed her voice, gentle but insistent. Elizabeth finally gave the ghost a name. Amelia, she whispered. Richard's first wife. The one who left him. Chloe's eyes widened with dawning comprehension. She remembered the stories, the family myth of the beautiful, flighty Amelia who broke Richard's heart and vanished. A woman her grandfather never ever spoke of. A name that was forbidden. They're using your past against you. Chloe breathed, her voice laced with venom. They're trying to build a case that you're confused, delusional. They'll twist this note, say you wrote it yourself. Oh, this is sick. This is so much worse than I thought. She stood up, pacing the floor, her mind a sharp legal instrument already whirring. Okay, okay. They want to play dirty. We can play dirty. They want to talk about competency. Let's talk about elder abuse, coercion, malicious intent. Sarah threatening you with legal action to get your house is a crime. Your son, standing by and letting it happen, makes him complicit. She stopped pacing and looked at Elizabeth, her eyes blazing with a protective fire. You are not weak, Grandma, and you are not alone. Not anymore. I'm a law student at NYU. I work with the Innocence Project. I know how to dig. I know how to fight. And I will be damned if I let those two vultures do this to you. For the first time since Richard's funeral, a sliver of genuine hope broke through the grey fog of Elizabeth's fear. She looked at this brilliant, fierce young woman, this girl who carried none of her father's weakness, and saw the reflection of a person she herself might have been in another life. An unlikely alliance forged in a crisis. It was a start. What do we do? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely audible. Chloe picked up her laptop bag from the foyer. We start by finding out everything there is to know about the ghost. That night, the house felt different. The oppressive silence was still there, but now it was punctuated by the soft, rhythmic clicking of Chloe's laptop keys. They sat at the heavy oak dining table, a pool of light from a single lamp pushing back the shadows. David and Sarah had retired to their room, early a silent, sulking retreat, after a brief, tense dinner of takeout KFC that no one had the appetite to eat. Okay, Chloe said, her face illuminated by the bluish glow of the screen. I'm starting broad. Local social media, community Facebook groups. Willow Creek Community Forum. Willow Creek rants and raves. Memories of old Willow Creek. People love to gossip, especially about prominent families. Elizabeth watched, fascinated. The world had changed so much. Her secrets had been kept by silence and fear. Now Chloe was hunting for them in a web of connections and digital whispers. I'm searching for keywords. Chloe explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Your name, David's, Sarah's, the address of the house. I'm looking for any chatter. Any posts from neighbours about them visiting, any comments they've made to friends about taking care of Mom or the big old house. For an hour, she scrolled through years of mundane posts. Lost cats, complaints about garbage pickup, grainy photos of high school football games. Nothing. They've been careful, Chloe muttered, leaning back in her chair and rubbing her eyes. Or they're better liars than I thought. She took a sip of cold tea. All right. New angle. She looked at Elizabeth. The note. You must become her. Amelia. She typed the name into her search bar. Amelia Vance, Willow Creek. The results were sparse. A few mentions in old society pages from the early 70s announcing her marriage to the up-and-coming businessman Richard Vance. A photo of them at a hospital fundraiser, Amelia, a black and white figure with a dazzling smile and dark, haunted eyes. And then, nothing. That's odd, Chloe said, leaning closer to the screen. For a supposed socialite, she just vanishes from the public record. There's a digital black hole. All the local news archives, the town's historical society website, they have plenty from 73-74, then a huge gap in 75. It picks up again in 76, but she's just gone. No mention of a divorce, no forwarding address. It's like she ceased to exist. Elizabeth felt a cold dread creep up her spine. Richard was a very private man. He had a lot of influence in this town even back then. Influence can buy silence, Chloe said, her voice grim. But the internet has a long memory. She switched tactics, navigating to a different set of databases, ones she had access to through her university's law library. Deep archives, digitized microfiche, obscure public records. She typed in the name again, but this time she added a date range. 1975. She scrolled through pages of irrelevant data: birth announcements, town council meeting, minutes, agricultural reports. Her eyes were starting to blur. She was about to give up for the night when she saw it. A strange file name from a defunct local paper, the Willow Creek Chronicle. The file was just a scanned image, poorly digitized. "I think I've got something," she breathed. She clicked the link. The image loaded slowly, line by painful line. It was a newspaper clipping. Small, buried on page 4, next to an ad for tractor parts. The headline was grainy but legible. Elizabeth leaned forward, her heart pounding. Chloe read it aloud, her voice steady and clear. Local woman Amelia Vance missing. Husband suspects foul play after abandonment. The air in the room grew cold. "It's dated November 5th, 1975, Chloe said. She read the article, her voice dropping into a measured, analytical tone. Willow Creek businessman Richard Vance reported his wife Amelia Vance, 28, missing late last night. Mr. Vance told authorities he returned home from a business trip to find his wife gone. A note which Mr. Vance described as incoherent and distressing suggested she had left him. "I am devastated," Mr. Vance stated in a brief interview. "Amelia has been unwell for some time. I believe she may have been seeing another man. I fear he may have convinced her to run away or worse." Police Chief Martin Brody confirmed they are treating it as a missing person case, but said evidence points towards voluntary departure. "There are no signs of forced entry or a struggle," Chief Brody said. "It seems Mrs. Vance packed a bag and left. We are following up on all leads, but at this time, we do not suspect a criminal act was committed at the residence." Friends of the couple were shocked, describing Amelia as a devoted, if somewhat shy, wife. "Mr. Vance has asked for privacy as he prays for his wife's safe return." Chloe finished reading and looked up at Elizabeth. The silence in the room was deafening. "Unwell," Chloe repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. The classic excuse. He painted her as unstable and promiscuous. He gave the police an easy out, a simple narrative. She ran off with a lover. Case closed. He told everyone that Elizabeth whispered the memory, making her feel sick. "When I met him a year later, he was the tragic, abandoned husband. The whole town pitied him. He controlled the narrative completely," Chloe said, scrolling back to the article. "And the police chief just bought it. No signs of a struggle." Of course there weren't. Not if he was the one who made her leave. Or... She let the thought hang in the air, unspoken but terrible. "This helps us, Grandma Chloe," said, her focus returning. "This proves there's a history of strange events connected to this house, connected to women Richard controlled. If David and Sarah try to claim you're delusional, we can present this. We can ask why a man's first wife vanishes under suspicious circumstances, and then 50 years later, his second wife is being threatened with a note that references the first. It creates a pattern of behavior, a pattern of abuse, a pattern of terror. Elizabeth knew the pattern intimately. She had lived inside it. But now, seeing it laid out in the stark black and white text of a forgotten newspaper, it felt different. It felt real. It felt like evidence. "There's more," Elizabeth said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "There has to be more." She looked past Chloe, her gaze falling on the hallway that led toward the back of the house, toward the one room that had been Richard's sanctuary, his fortress, his study. Chloe followed her gaze. "The one Dad said was off limits. He always kept it locked," Elizabeth said. "Even from me. After he died, David locked it up again. Said he wanted to preserve his father's memory. He treats it like a shrine." A new, dangerous idea began to form. An idea born of desperation and a newfound courage. "When do David and Sarah leave the house?" Chloe asked, already closing her laptop. Tomorrow morning, Elizabeth replied, her heart starting to race again, but this time it was with adrenaline, not just fear. They have a meeting with a real estate appraiser. Chloe's lips curved into a grim smile. Perfect. Then tomorrow morning, we go ghost hunting in the one room the ghost never wanted us to see. The next morning, the house was thick with a tense, false pleasantry. Sarah, dressed in a sharp pantsuit, made a point of discussing the housing market over breakfast. Her words aimed like daggers at Elizabeth. David just stared into his coffee cup, a portrait of weak-willed misery. The market in this neighborhood is peaking, Sarah said brightly. An aggressive valuation now could be extremely profitable. It's all about timing. Chloe just smiled sweetly. Oh, I'm sure. Real estate is so fascinating. You'll have to tell me all about it when you get back. The moment the front door closed behind them, the silence in the house shifted. It was no longer oppressive. It was electric, with possibility. Elizabeth and Chloe looked at each other. No words were needed. They walked down the hall to the study. The door was dark, imposing oak. The brass knob was cold to the touch. Elizabeth tried it. Locked. Solid. He was so proud of this lock, Elizabeth murmured. An old pin tumbler model from Germany. He said it was unpickable. Chloe pulled a bobby pin from her hair and bent it into a new shape. She then took a small metal tension wrench from a tiny toolkit on her keychain. Let's see about that, she said with a wink. My freshman year roommate was a kleptomaniac with a passion for vintage hardware. I learned a few things. She knelt before the lock, inserting the tension wrench and applying gentle pressure. Then she slid the bobby pin into the keyhole. The only sound was the faint metallic scrape of pin against tumbler. Elizabeth held her breath. For a minute that stretched into 5, nothing happened. It's a good lock I'll give him. That, Chloe muttered, her brow furrowed in concentration. But it's old. She adjusted the pressure, probed again. Click. A tiny, almost inaudible sound. Click. Another. Elizabeth's hands were clenched into fists at her sides. Click. Click. And then a final, louder click that echoed in the silent hallway. The tension wrench turned slightly. Chloe grinned, pulled out her tools and turned the knob. The heavy door swung open with a low groan. They stepped inside. The air was stale, thick, with the smell of old paper leather and Richard's cologne. It was a room designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound sets of books that looked like they had never been opened. A massive mahogany desk, polished to a mirror shine. On the wall, a large oil-painted portrait of Richard from 20 years ago, his painted eyes seeming to follow them with smug disapproval. It was a tomb of ego. Wow, Chloe breathed. Talk about a monument to yourself. They started searching. Elizabeth, with a frantic energy, went through the desk drawers. They were filled with old business files organized with obsessive precision. Financial statements, deeds to other properties, but nothing personal. Nothing about Amelia. Chloe ran her hands along the bookshelves. Law books, encyclopedias, the complete works of men who died 200 years ago. He was really trying to project an image, wasn't he? She moved along the wall, trailing her fingers over the spines. She paused at a section filled with matching dark green leather volumes. Halsbury's Laws of England, she read. Serious stuff. She pulled one of the heavy books from the shelf. As she did, her eyes caught something. Behind the row of books, the dark wood paneling of the wall didn't look quite right. The vertical seam where 2 panels met was slightly wider than the others, the grain of the wood just a fraction off. Grandma, she said, her voice low, come look at this. Elizabeth came over. Chloe pointed. See that the join is uneven. They pushed on the panel. It didn't move. They tried to find a latch, a button, a trick book on the shelf. Nothing. It has to open, Chloe insisted. She ran her fingers along the seam again, pressing hard. Near the bottom, her fingers found a tiny indentation. It was almost invisible. She pressed it. Nothing happened. She pushed harder, using all her weight. A low click echoed in the room. The seam on the panel widened by a millimeter. Using her fingernails, Chloe pried at the edge. It was stiff. With a groan of aging wood, the panel swung inward, revealing a dark, square cavity hidden in the wall. The space was dark and thick with the smell of dust and time. It wasn't a safe. There was no money, no jewelry, no important documents. There was only one thing inside. A small leather-bound book, its cover brittle and warped with age. A faded silk ribbon, once blue, was tied around it, holding it shut. Elizabeth reached in her hand, trembling so badly she could barely grasp it. She lifted it into the light. The leather was dry and cracked. On the front cover, embossed in what was once gold leaf, were two simple initials. R.V. Amelia Vance. Elizabeth stared at the diary, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a book. It was a voice. A voice Richard had tried to silence forever. And they had just found it. The leather was cool and brittle beneath Elizabeth's fingertips, a relic from a time she had forced her mind to forget. The tiny lock, once shiny brass, was now tarnished green in its corners. It had sprung open so easily a secret that had only been waiting for a willing hand. Chloe sat beside her on the floor of Richard's study, the forbidden room, a space that still smelled faintly of his cologne and expensive cigars. The air was thick with the dust of 50 years of silence. Chloe held a small flashlight from her phone, casting a bright, sterile circle of light onto the small leather-bound book with the initials A.V. embossed in faded gold. Elizabeth's hand trembled as she opened the cover. The first page was written in a beautiful looping script full of youthful optimism. Chloe began to read it aloud, her voice soft, a stark contrast to the words that would soon follow. Chloe read it. Please. Elizabeth's own voice was a dry whisper. She couldn't trust herself to form the words. Chloe nodded, her young face set, with a grim determination. June 12th, 1974. My dearest diary, I am Mrs. Richard Vance. It still feels like a dream. To think that a man like Richard, so brilliant, so handsome, would choose me. He calls me his perfect porcelain doll. This house, it's a palace. He says it's my kingdom now. Today he brought me a single perfect white rose and told me I am more beautiful than any flower he could ever grow. I believe we will be deliriously happy here forever. Elizabeth closed her eyes. She remembered Richard saying those same words to her. His porcelain doll. She had thought it was romantic then. Now it felt like the first bar of a cage being lowered into place. Keep going. She urged, her voice a little stronger. Chloe flipped a few pages, her brow furrowing. The handwriting was becoming smaller, more cramped. August 3rd, 1974. Richard was displeased today. I wore the yellow dress he dislikes. I didn't know he disliked it. He never said. But his face went cold. He didn't raise his voice. He never does. He just explained very calmly that a woman of my station, his wife, should have better taste. He said the colour made me look sallow common. He took the dress from my closet and burned it in the fireplace. He said it was a lesson in aesthetics. I cried, and that made it worse. He said tears were a form of manipulation, and he would not be manipulated. He didn't speak to me for the rest of the night. A cold dread, horribly familiar, washed over Elizabeth. She remembered the blue scarf. Her mother had given it to her. Richard had used it to clean his shoes one day, telling her it was better suited for the task. She had never mentioned it again. There's more, Chloe said, her voice tight. So much more. It gets worse, Grandma. I know, Elizabeth said. Read it. Chloe took a deep breath. December 25th. 1974. Christmas. Richard gave me a beautiful diamond necklace. But first he made me list every mistake I had made that month. Every dish I slightly overcooked every time I spoke out of turn at a dinner party, every opinion I offered that he hadn't approved first. For each mistake, he would tap my wrist with his silver letter opener. Not hard enough to leave a mark, just a reminder. A cold, sharp little shock. Then he smiled and fastened the diamonds around my neck and said, "See, perfection requires discipline." I feel the cold of the diamonds more than the cold of the steel. Elizabeth unconsciously rubbed her own wrist. The ghost of 100 such reminders prickled at her skin. The gaslighting, the constant low-level terror that kept her perfectly poised, perfectly silent, perfectly his. Chloe flipped further into the diary. The entries were sporadic now, the handwriting jagged as if written by a hand shaking with fear or rage. May 16th, 1975. He has started talking about her again, the woman before me. He never told me he was married before. He said she was a footnote, a mistake he had rectified. But now he talks about her. He says she was truly perfect, that she understood what it meant to be his wife. Last night he found one of her old gowns in a trunk in the attic. He made me put it on. It didn't fit right. It smelled of old perfume and mothballs. He walked around me, his eyes. They weren't looking at me. He was looking at someone else. He called me by her name. He called me Amelia. When I started to cry, he slapped me. It was the first time he ever left a mark. He apologized afterward. He said my imperfection, my failure to embody her spirit had driven him to it. He said it was my fault. Elizabeth let out a sound, a choked sob, that was 50 years in the making. Chloe stopped reading and put her hand on her grandmother's arm. "Grandma, we can stop." "No." Elizabeth said, her eyes blazing with a fire Chloe had never seen before. "He did that to me too. Her name was Amelia. He told me she ran off. A liar. He was always a liar. He tried to turn me into her ghost. He almost succeeded." She stared at the diary, at the book that held not just Amelia's story, but the preface to her own. "Find the last entry, Chloe. Find the end." Chloe's fingers, nimble and sure, turned the last few pages. They were stuck together as if with a tear or a drop of water. She carefully separated them. The final page was dated. The ink was slightly blurred. October 31st, 1975. Chloe read her voice, barely a whisper, now the sterile light of her phone seeming to tremble on the page. He spent all day digging by the old oak, in the back of the garden. He never does yard work. He hires people for that. But today he dug, all day. His suit jacket was off his sleeves, rolled up. Sweat on his brow. I asked him what he was doing. He smiled that smile, the one that doesn't reach his eyes. He says it's a foundation for a new rose trellis, a gift for me for our anniversary. His prize-winning roses need a grander stage, he said. But his eyes were wrong. There was nothing in them, just dirt. I know he is not digging for roses. Chloe paused, her own breathing catching in her throat. She looked at Elizabeth, whose face was a mask of stone. "Read the rest of it, child." Elizabeth commanded, her voice like iron. Chloe looked back at the page, at the last few desperate lines. "If I am not here tomorrow, know that I did not run. Know that I did not leave him. He told me he would never let me leave him. He said I belonged to him in this house forever. I am planted in his garden." Silence. The only sound in the room was the hum of the old grandfather clock in the hall, ticking away the seconds of a life that had been stolen. Chloe slowly closed the book. The soft thud of the leather cover echoed like a shovelful of dirt hitting a coffin. "Grandma?" Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with horror and a dawning, terrible understanding. The roses, the prize-winning roses by the old oak tree. He won his first blue ribbon the next summer. Elizabeth said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Everyone said he had a gift, a green thumb. The sound of a key in the front door lock shattered the stillness. Heavy footsteps in the hall. "Mom, I'm home. Sarah's just parking the car." David's voice called out, laced with a false, practiced cheerfulness. "Are you in here? Why is the study door open?" Elizabeth stood up. The frailty that had clung to her like a shroud for decades seemed to fall away, sloughing off to reveal something hard and unbreakable beneath. She picked up the diary. Its weight felt both immense and insignificant in her hand. It was just a book, but it was also a tombstone. "Stay here," she said to Chloe, her voice low and firm. Chloe nodded, her phone still in her hand, its screen dark. Elizabeth walked out of the study and met her son in the grand foyer. He was shrugging off his expensive coat, a look of mild irritation on his face. "Mum, I've told you Dad's study is off limits. You know how he was about his privacy." "Oh, I know exactly how he was about his privacy," Elizabeth said. Her voice didn't waver. It was clear and cold as ice water. It made David stop and look at her properly for the first time. He saw the expression on her face, and his own faltered. "What is it? What's that you're holding?" "A story," Elizabeth said, holding up the diary. "About a young bride. Your father's first young bride." David's face went pale. "What are you talking about? Dad was only married to you." "Was he?" Elizabeth asked, a cruel little smile touching her lips. "That's the story he told, isn't it? The one everyone believed." She stepped closer, invading his space, forcing him to look at her. Her name was Amelia, and this was her diary. David recoiled as if she'd tried to strike him. "This is insane. Mom, you're not well. Sarah was right. We need to get you help. You're inventing things." "Am I?" Elizabeth's voice was a blade. "Then this shouldn't bother you." She opened the diary to the last tear-stained page and held it out to him. "Read it, David. Read Amelia's last words." He stared at the book, his eyes darting from the frantic script to his mother's unyielding face. He didn't want to touch it. He didn't want to know. "I'm not reading some fantasy you've cooked up. Read it," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority he hadn't heard since he was a small child who had tracked mud across her clean floors. "Read it aloud. I want to hear you say the words." Hesitantly, his hand shaking, David took the diary. His eyes scanned the page, his lips moving silently at first. Then his breath hitched. The color drained completely from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. It says," he stammered, unable to speak. The image of his father, the strong, respectable, brilliant man he had idolized his entire life, was cracking, shattering into a million pieces. No, it's not possible. Dad, he loved his garden. He loved those roses. He loved what they covered," Elizabeth said flatly. Just then, the front door burst open, and Sarah swept in her face, a thundercloud. "What is going on in here, David?" I could hear her shouting from the driveway. I knew it. I knew we couldn't leave her alone for 1 minute. Her eyes fell on the diary in David's hand, and she lunged, snatching it from his grasp. "What is this garbage?" She flipped through the pages with contempt. "Let me guess. A long-lost diary. Oh, that is rich. How pathetic." She stopped at the last page, her eyes scanning it quickly. A smirk twisted her lips. "Planted in his garden. Oh, for God's sake, this is the most ridiculous melodramatic forgery I have ever seen." "It's real," David whispered, still staring at the spot where the book had been. "The handwriting? It changes? It's real?" "Don't be a fool, David," Sarah snapped, turning on him. "She's manipulating you." It's what old senile people do. They invent fantasies to get attention to control their children. She knows how much we want this house, and she's concocted this horror story to make us back off. Sarah turned back to Elizabeth, her eyes glittering with malice. You've really lost it this time, haven't you? You know what? This is it. This is the final straw. She pulled her sleek, expensive smartphone from her purse, her thumb swiping angrily across the screen. We're calling the lawyer, Mark Jennings. He specializes in elder law. We'll have you evaluated, declared incompetent. We'll have you committed by morning. You'll be in a nice, clean, secure facility where you can't hurt yourself or anyone else with these disgusting fantasies. She held the phone up, her voice a triumphant snarl. Say goodbye to your kingdom, Elizabeth. You're done. David stood frozen, a statue of indecision and shock. He looked from his snarling wife to his mother's strangely calm face. Part of him, the part that had been trained since birth to obey his father and seek his approval, screamed that Sarah was right. This was a madness, a fiction. But another part, a part that had just seen the terror in the ink on that page, knew that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. As Sarah's thumb hovered over the call button, a new voice cut through the tension, calm and clear as a bell. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sarah. Everyone turned. Chloe was standing in the doorway of the study. She was holding up her own phone, its screen glowing. Sarah laughed, a short, ugly sound. And what are you going to do, little girl? Call the campus police? No. Chloe said, her eyes fixed on Sarah. Her voice was steady, professional, the voice of a future lawyer laying out an irrefutable case. I've been live streaming. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. What? Sarah breathed, her own phone lowering slightly. For the last 10 minutes, Chloe continued, her gaze unwavering. Ever since you walked in the door. It's on a private Twitch stream. The only viewers are my evidence professor, Dr. Alastair Finch, and 2 of my colleagues from the university's Innocence Project. They're all watching. They're all listening. Sarah's face, which had been flushed with rage, went completely slack with shock. Chloe took a small step forward. They heard you call your mother-in-law senile. They heard you dismiss a potential piece of evidence in a 50-year-old missing persons case as a pathetic forgery without any examination. They heard you threaten to have her involuntarily committed as a direct response to her refusing to give you her house. They heard you name your lawyer and state your intent to have her declared incompetent by morning. Chloe's voice dropped, becoming even colder, more precise. That's called coercion of a vulnerable adult Sarah. It's a felony. My professor, who is also a practicing attorney, has been taking notes. He's the one who advised me to keep recording. He said your threats constituted textbook evidence for a future legal challenge against your petition for guardianship, and likely a criminal investigation into conspiracy to commit elder fraud. David made a choking sound, stumbling back against a wall. Sarah stared at Chloe's phone as if it were a venomous snake. The blood drained from her face. Her own phone slipped from her suddenly numb fingers and clattered onto the marble floor. In fact, Chloe added a hint of steel entering her voice. Professor Finch has already taken the liberty of contacting the Willow Creek Police Department. He's forwarding them a link to the stream, along with his professional opinion that the diary and your reaction to it constitutes probable cause to investigate a potential homicide. He seems to think they'll be very interested. As if on cue from far in the distance, a faint sound began to rise. A single mournful note growing steadily louder. A siren. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held Elizabeth. She looked past Sarah's horrified face, past Chloe's grim determination. She looked directly at her son, at David, who was sliding down the wall, his face buried in his hands, his entire world collapsing around him. "David?" she said. Her voice was no longer cold or hard. It was filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost terrifying. That note, the one I found on my luggage when I came home. The one that said I had to become her. David looked up, his face streaked with tears. I I swear, Mom, I don't know where that came from. I thought I thought you wrote it. That you were confused? No, Elizabeth said, shaking her head slowly. The siren was closer now, a piercing, undeniable wail. You didn't write the original, David, but your father did. She took a breath, the first truly free breath she had taken in 50 years. The truth, ugly and monstrous, was clawing its way out. After he killed Amelia, after he put her in the ground, he didn't just go on with his life. He couldn't. There were questions. Her family was asking, a few friends. He needed an alibi. He needed time. She looked at her son, forcing him to see the abyss that had been her life. He held me captive in this house, David, for 2 months. The world thought I was just his new secretary staying in the guest quarters. No one knew. And on the first night, he slid a piece of paper under my door, that exact same note. If you want to stay here, you must become her. He forced me to be Amelia. The horror on David's face was absolute. Sarah was frozen, a statue of dawning ruin. I had to answer her mail. Elizabeth's voice broke, but she pushed on the words, tumbling out a torrent of suppressed agony. I had to learn her signature. He would stand over me for hours until it was perfect. He made me wear her clothes, sit in her favorite chair in the sunroom so the neighbors could see a figure through the window. He'd make me walk in the garden at dusk, always from a distance, creating the illusion that Amelia was still alive, just grieving or reclusive before she finally disappeared for good. He was building his alibi brick by brick, using my body, my fear. I was his puppet. He paraded her ghost around for 2 months, and I was the ghost. Only then, when everyone believed Amelia had simply packed a bag and left, only then did he allow me to meet him. Only then did he introduce me to his friends as Elizabeth, the woman who had finally mended his broken heart. The sirens were screaming now right outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the foyer windows, painting the walls in frantic, strobing colors. Elizabeth walked over to her son and knelt before him, her hands on his trembling shoulders. The note you left wasn't a demand, David. It was an echo. Your father kept the original. He kept it in his desk. You must have found it. You must have thought. I don't know what you thought. But you repeated his words. You repeated the single most cruel, sadistic act of possession he ever committed against me. You brought his voice back from the dead. She stood up, her confession complete. The weight of it seemed to leave her settling onto the expensive carpets, the polished wood, the very foundation of the house. She was light. She was free. She turned and looked towards the back of the house, towards the pristine, manicured garden beyond the French doors. Do you want to know where Amelia is? She said, her voice finally cracking into a million pieces of grief and relief. You want to find the first Mrs. Vance. She looked at the flashing lights, at the uniformed figures now visible through the glass. Get a shovel, she whispered. Dig under your father's prize-winning roses. By the old oak tree. The wail of the sirens grew from a distant cry to a piercing shriek that saturated the manicured air of Willow Creek. It was a sound of violation, an alarm tearing through the neighborhood's carefully constructed illusion of peace. Police cruisers, their blue and red lights flashing in a frantic, silent disco across the face of the house, blocked the street. They moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, their presence a stark declaration that the charade was over. From the living room window, Elizabeth watched them erect the yellow tape. It looked so flimsy, a child's craft project, yet it held the entire world at bay. It cordoned off 50 years of secrets, transforming her prison into a formal crime scene. Neighbors, drawn from their homes by the commotion, began to gather. They stood in small, whispering clusters on the far side of the street, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and a dark, undeniable curiosity. They looked at her house, Richard's house, as if seeing it for the first time, its perfect facade now seeming sinister like a mask. Chloe stood beside her, a solid, grounding presence. Her hand rested on Elizabeth's shoulder, not holding her up, but simply there, a silent statement of solidarity. "They're here, Grandma," she said softly. "They're finally here." Elizabeth nodded, her gaze fixed on a young officer unspooling another line of tape around the ancient oak tree. "Yes, they are." The front door opened, and a woman in a practical blazer with a detective's shield clipped to her belt stepped inside. She had tired eyes, but a sharp, focused expression. "Mrs. Collins, I'm Detective Miller. We have the warrant. I need to ask you and your granddaughter to remain in the living room for now. We'll need to take your formal statements shortly." Sarah appeared in the archway to the dining room, her face pale, and pinched her phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. "You can't do this? This is a private residence. I've spoken to our lawyer, and he says—" Detective Miller didn't even turn her head fully. "Ma'am, your lawyer is welcome to meet you at the station. Right now, this is an active crime scene. Please sit down." Her voice was flat, containing no room for argument. Sarah's mouth snapped shut, a flicker of genuine fear finally extinguishing her bluster. She sank into an armchair, her knuckles white on her phone. David was a ghost. He sat on the sofa, staring at a spot on the floor, his body so still he seemed to have stopped breathing. The man who had idolized his father, who had inherited his legacy, was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out shell, the foundations of his entire life, pulverized into dust by the words in a diary. He hadn't spoken a word since Elizabeth had finished reading Amelia's final entry. Outside, the forensics team began its work. White vans had pulled up, and people in quiet, serious jumpsuits began to move across the lawn, carrying equipment that looked both scientific and vaguely medieval. They set up lights, tripods, and screens. The pristine grass, where Richard had hosted so many neighborhood barbecues where David had played as a boy, was now being mapped out in a grid of string and stakes. The focus of their attention was the rose garden, specifically the triumphant prize-winning blooms Richard had been so proud of right at the base of the old oak. Chloe led Elizabeth to a chair with a clear view of the garden. "Are you sure you want to watch this?" she whispered. "I have to," Elizabeth said, her voice steady. "I owe it to her. I can't look away now." The process was slow, methodical, almost reverent. The team photographed everything. They carefully removed the rose bushes, laying them aside on a tarp like fallen soldiers. Then two of them picked up shovels. The first cut into the earth was a dull, sickening thud that seemed to echo inside Elizabeth's chest. For 50 years, that patch of ground had been a lie, a beautiful, flowering lie. Richard had tended to it with such care, his hands covered in dirt, smiling at her as he worked. "For the new climbing roses, darling," he'd said. "They need strong foundations." Now, every shovelful of that dark, rich soil felt like an exhumation of her own life, of all the years she had spent tending to his secrets. The neighbors watched in horrified silence. The whispers had stopped. Even the news cameras, which had arrived and set up a vulture's row down the street, seemed to hold their breath. The only sounds were the scrape of metal on stone, the soft murmur of the forensic team, and the distant rhythmic clicking of camera shutters. David made a choked sound, a strangled sob. He finally looked up, his eyes finding Elizabeth's across the room. They were filled with a terrifying, bottomless despair. It wasn't just grief. It was the agony of a man realizing his entire identity was built on a monstrous falsehood. The father he'd worshipped wasn't just flawed. He was a monster. The house he coveted was a tomb. He made me help him. David whispered the words, ragged. That weekend, He told me we were building a new trellis. I was 12. I held the nails. I thought, I thought he was teaching me how to build things. He covered his face with his hands, his body racked with a dry, silent quake. Sarah shot him a look of pure venom. David, shut up. Don't say another word until our lawyer gets here. But it was too late. Detective Miller had heard. She made a small, almost imperceptible gesture to another officer, who quietly moved to stand a few feet away from David. Outside, one of the diggers stopped. He knelt down, trading his shovel for a small trowel, then a brush. He worked carefully, gently brushing away the soil. He looked up and nodded at his superior. The superior, in turn, looked toward the house and gave a solemn, definitive nod to Detective Miller. They had found her. Elizabeth felt the air leave her lungs, a breath she'd been holding for half a century. She didn't need to see. She knew. She had always known. She was there, right there, under the blood-red roses. Amelia, a hush, fell over the entire street. Time seemed to warp, stretching and thinning. The forensic team worked with even greater care, now their movements precise and delicate. Slowly, painstakingly, they uncovered the truth. It wasn't glorious or triumphant. It was ugly and sad. A human skeleton curled in the fetal position, brittle and stained by the earth. They cleared the dirt from a hand, the delicate bones of the fingers still intact. And there, on the fourth finger, was a simple gold band, glinting dully in the harsh glare of the forensic lights. It was Richard's first wedding ring, the one he'd told Elizabeth he had lost. A collective gasp went through the crowd of neighbours. The perfect facade of Willow Creek, of the perfect Collins family, didn't just crack. It exploded, showering the quiet suburban street with the shrapnel of a 50-year-old crime. The camera shutters began to click again, faster now, a frantic, hungry sound devouring the scene, broadcasting the rot from under the roses to the entire world. Elizabeth closed her eyes. She didn't see the skeleton, or the cameras, or her shattered son. She saw Amelia's face smiling from a photograph Richard had kept. She heard the last words from the diary. "I am not running away. I am being planted in his garden. It's over." Elizabeth murmured more to herself than to anyone else. "Amelia, it's finally over." In the days that followed, the story didn't just become news. It became a phenomenon. It was a perfect, horrifying storm of suburban secrets, hidden evil, and long-delayed justice. The image of the forensic team lifting the skeletal remains from beneath the prize-winning roses was on every screen, a macabre symbol of the darkness lurking beneath pristine surfaces. The hashtag, Justice for Amelia, didn't just trend. It dominated the global conversation for weeks. It was on Twitter, on TikTok, on every newsfeed. People who had never heard of Willow Creek were now intimately familiar with the story of Amelia Vance, the woman who was planted in her own garden. The live stream Chloe had made became the linchpin of the case against Sarah. It was played on national news networks, a masterclass in self-incrimination. Legal analysts dissected Sarah's every word, her threats to have Elizabeth committed, her frantic attempts to dismiss the diary. Her carefully curated social world imploded overnight. The invitations stopped. The calls went unreturned. Friends she'd known for years crossed the street to avoid her. She was no longer Sarah Collins, the poised wife of a successful businessman. She was a pariah, a cartoon villain in a real-life horror story. An official investigation was launched into conspiracy and attempted elder financial abuse, her reputation dissolving like sugar in acid. David was a different kind of wreckage. Broken hollowed, he offered no resistance. In his formal interviews with Detective Miller, he cooperated fully. His voice, a monotone whisper. He recounted every memory of his father that now seemed sinister in retrospect. The locked office, the sudden, inexplicable moods, the obsession with the rose garden. He talked about his own complicity, the willful blindness he had cultivated for years because the truth was too monstrous to consider. He wasn't a monster like his father, the police concluded, but a man so weakened by a lifetime of indoctrination that he had lost his own moral compass. He was an empty vessel, filled only with shame and a grief so profound it seemed to have erased his personality. For Elizabeth, the world tilted in a new and unfamiliar way. For 50 years she had been invisible, a ghost in her own home, her voice silenced first by a husband and then by her own children. Now she was seen. She was heard. Reporters camped outside the police tape shouting her name, but she ignored them. Her testimony was given in a quiet, sterile room with only Detective Miller, a prosecutor, and Chloe present. She spoke with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She didn't perform her grief or her trauma. She simply stated the facts, her voice as clear and steady as a bell. She recounted the early years of her marriage, Richard's chilling obsession with recreating Amelia. She described the 2 months after Amelia's murder, when Richard had forced her to become a phantom, to keep Amelia alive in the eyes of the world, to establish his alibi. She told them about the note he'd left her, the original of the one she had placed on her own suitcase, a final, cruel twist of psychological torture. He didn't just kill her. Elizabeth said, her eyes meeting Detective Miller's. He tried to erase her, and when he couldn't erase her, he tried to replace her. With me. For 50 years, I have carried the weight of 2 women. Myself and the ghost he made me into. Chloe sat beside her, her hand resting on her grandmother's, her eyes shining with tears, not of sadness, but of fierce, brilliant pride. She was no longer just a law student. She was a witness to history, to the moment her grandmother finally reclaimed her own narrative. One evening, a few weeks after the excavation, they sat in the sterile quiet of a hotel room, watching the news. A panel of experts was discussing the case. A psychologist was talking about coercive control and long-term trauma. A legal scholar was praising the ingenious use of social media that had exposed Sarah's intentions. An image of Elizabeth, a candid shot of her leaving the police station, her face calm and resolved, appeared on the screen. The chyron beneath it read, "The Survivor, Elizabeth Collins' 50-year fight for truth." Chloe turned to her. "They see you, Grandma. The whole world sees you." Elizabeth watched her own face on the screen, a stranger in a story that was hers. "They see a survivor," she said softly. "But I don't feel like I survived a fight. I feel like I've just woken up from a very long sleep." She looked at Chloe, a real genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "And you were the one who woke me up." The house sold quickly. Not to a family, of course. No one wanted to raise their children on that tainted soil. It was bought by a development corporation that would likely tear it down and build something new and anonymous in its place, erasing the physical structure, just as Richard had tried to erase a human life. The real estate agent, a man with a practiced, somber expression, handled the transaction with a hushed reverence, as if he were dealing with a holy site. The money, when it landed in Elizabeth's bank account, felt heavy, cursed. It was stained with blood and secrets, the proceeds of a lifetime of lies. Elizabeth met with a financial advisor, a sharp, kind woman recommended by Chloe's law professor. They sat in a sterile, glass-walled office overlooking the city, a world away from Willow Creek. "It's a considerable sum, Mrs. Collins," the advisor said, pushing a folder across the table. "We can set up a portfolio trusts for your family." "No," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. Chloe, sitting beside her, gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "I don't want it. Almost none of it." The advisor looked surprised. "I'm sorry, that money doesn't belong to me," Elizabeth explained patiently. "It was built on Richard's success, and his success was built on a crime. It belongs to the woman he silenced. It belongs to Amelia. Over the next hour, Elizabeth laid out her plan. The vast majority of the funds would be used to establish a national endowment, a network of shelters and legal aid funds for victims of domestic violence. It would be called the Amelia Vance Foundation. Her name, which Richard had tried so hard to bury, would now be a beacon of hope for thousands. A portion would go to Chloe for her education and her future. For herself, Elizabeth kept only a small, modest amount, just enough. As they left the office, stepping out into the bright afternoon sun, Elizabeth felt a lightness she hadn't known was possible. It was as if she had physically shed a great weight she had been carrying on her back for 50 years. She didn't return to Willow Creek. Chloe packed up the few personal belongings she wanted from the house-old photographs of her as a child, a set of teacups that had belonged to Elizabeth's mother, a handful of books. Everything else was left behind. They drove west. For 3 days, they crossed the country, leaving the ghosts of the past further behind with every mile. They drove through plains and mountains, watching the landscape change the world opening up before them. They talked for hours, not about Richard or the trial, but about everything else. About Chloe's dreams of becoming a prosecutor. About Elizabeth's childhood by the sea, a memory she hadn't allowed herself to visit in decades. She bought a small cottage on the Oregon coast, a simple place with cedar shingles weathered grey by the salt and wind. It stood on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, with a small garden where she could plant whatever she wanted. There were no prize-winning roses. The final scene of the story wasn't in a courtroom or a news studio. It was on the beach, a wide expanse of sand, stretching out to meet a churning, silver-grey ocean. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender. Elizabeth and Chloe walked along the shoreline, the cold water washing over their bare feet. The air was clean and sharp, tasting of salt and freedom. They walked in a comfortable silence, the only sound the rhythmic roar of the waves crashing against the shore and the lonely cry of a gull overhead. "Professor Albright called yesterday," Chloe said, breaking the quiet. "She said the Amelia Vance Foundation received its first round of corporate donations. They're going to be able to open 2 new shelters by the end of the year." Elizabeth smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "That's good," she said. "That's very good." They stopped and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, the last sliver of light disappearing with a soft green flash. The sky deepened to a rich, velvety indigo. Elizabeth closed her eyes. She breathed in deeply, filling her lungs with the cool, salty air. For 50 years her head had been a noisy, crowded place. It was filled with Richard's voice, his criticisms, his demands, his expectations. It was filled with the ghost of Amelia, a presence she had been forced to carry. It was filled with the whispers of her own fear, her own resignation. It was a constant, low-pressure system of anxiety and control. She had almost forgotten what silence sounded like, what her own thoughts sounded like when they were truly hers. But now, there was nothing. No voices, no whispers, no ghosts. The only sound was the eternal, powerful rush of the ocean, the sigh of the wind, and inside, for the first time in half a century, a profound and beautiful quiet. The only voice in her head was her own, and it was calm. She opened her eyes and looked out at the vast, endless sea. She was free. Elizabeth's story is one of unimaginable pain, but also of incredible strength. It's a reminder that even after decades of silence, the truth has a way of coming to light. But how many other stories like hers remain untold? What do you think is the biggest barrier for people trying to escape situations of silent abuse? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And let's talk about how we can all be better at listening to the voices that have been quiet for too long.